Welcome everyone. Welcome to the 22nd live stream of the Music Hackspace, and we are with Adrian Freed. Hello, Adrian.
Hi, JB. Thanks for having me.
Well, so it's a real pleasure. So you are a British man living in San Francisco area?
Yep, in Berkeley, California.
Great. Well, how is the lockdown affecting you?
Well, we were among the first to lock down, and everyone's taking it incredibly seriously, which is surprising because Berkeley's a place of traditional resistance. But they sent the students home, which was smart, and so here we are, wondering how to proceed like everybody else.
Good. Well, so you have a career that spans 45 years. When I announced this talk, I said 40, but in fact, I understand it's 45 because you started at a very young age. I don't know if you want to start there, but I think that's a very interesting anecdote.
Yeah, I will go into the anecdote. I got a couple of lucky breaks because I didn't have enough money to pursue my hobby, so I sent some ideas into magazines, and they. So if you count from the point I was actually paid for some thinking I did, it was unusually young. My career didn't really start in the field in terms of a major contribution till after my undergraduate degree.
Right. Okay, so I understand that today is going to be controversial in some ways. I mean, because you like a debate and you have positions and opinions on things, and you warned me that there might be controversy. So I'm looking forward to that, and I think the discussion that will ensue. So I'm inviting everyone who watched this live to also comment and voice it, and we'll bring up your comments on the screen and have discussions with Adrian. But for now, you have prepared some slides to go through, so I'm going to bring them up and let you go through that. I will disappear for now, but I will come back.
Okay. Well, let's start with that question of controversies. I like healthy debate and critical thinking. I'm not a big fan of arguing for its own sake or provocations for their own sake, but since there's only one of me up here and millions of opinions, sharing them is really important. So feel free, if I say something confusing or that you want to engage with, feel free to send some comments and we can answer those as we go. Some of them we may not be. JB's going to be the arbiter, but don't worry, I will read everything that gets posted afterwards, and you can, of course, engage with me. I'm fairly easy to reach because I decided for social networking to use my name. I know that's kind of radical, but you can find my name on all the usual platforms, except the ones that require a number. I just signed up for one of those, and the number is 6669, which was randomly allocated, but I was very happy with that number. It corresponds to this notion that I might be mischievous. So here we go. Oops. We are sharing the screen still, I hope. Yeah, there we go. And I'm just getting to the slide shift. Okay, so the overview is I'm going to chase a few elephants out of the room, and there'll be a few provocations along the way. But basically, at JB's invitation, I'm going to go chronologically through some things and touch on some things I'm known for, and especially look at the beginnings. And I looked at what this community is. It's very hard to tell looking at the talks, but I read the comments for a lot of the recent talks, and it seems to me, in terms of knowledge, people are trying to figure out what they should make, how to do it, and where they should do it. And this requires some engagement, social engagements. Now, hackers traditionally spend a lot of time hacking and making things. So I would say predominantly, and certainly this was true when I was a kid without any friends to make things with, the practical aspects of a big deal. But along the way, some theory and some concepts and some math and stuff really helps with this. So these are sort of the three spheres of engagement. And at first I thought it was a silly idea, me talking about where I started, because I started in a very different time in the 70s, where in terms of making things, it was a time of scarcity, no internet, no fast way to get an electronic component. The components were expensive. The people to do it with were rare and hard to find. And now we're in this opposite phase, at least I certainly found by 2010, where we have the opposite problem. Everything is now a shopping problem. There are too many choices of what to make, what to do, and where to get the information from. But then we got this COVID thing, which is taking us back into various kinds of scarcity. It's actually very hard to work with new people in the makerspaces, and it's certain parts. Delivery times are going up, and certain parts that I'm used to being able to get in 24 hours at Silicon Valley are starting to be hard to get. So I think it may be worthwhile kind of covering what, having some plasticity, figuring out some skills to deal with abundance, which, as I mentioned, are questions of judgment and choice, and scarcity, which requires more ingenuity and more collaboration. So here's the first elephant to kick out of the room. I really enjoyed the recent interviews JB did, and it's a great approach to ask the question of leading practitioners and read the NIME reader, which is what those practitioners think are the important works that were done, for example, and listen to me. But you also need to ask people who have less bias, because they're not practitioners. And I acknowledged my biases associated with privilege. The British have a quaint and rather disgusting saying, drinking their own bathwater. And this is what happens when you stay in the same circle and you publish among friends after a while. So you need to find some other sources. And these come from, these are a couple of fields which are kind of outside the making, but look at people making and look at the history of musical instruments and so on. And so I'll post some key names of people you can chase down and get some very interesting insights from. I'm thinking of people like Georgina Bourne, George Lewis, Jonathan Stern, Deirdre Lockridge, and so on. I apologize. These lists of people I want to mention can go on a long time, so lots of important omissions there, but that's a big thing to do. Get some outside views as well as some of your favorite people who make things that you like the look of. And this is, to me, if there's one slide that's the most important message slide in the whole talk, it's this one. Because this is where I got the most personal satisfaction and most successes. It was from this strategy. It's engaging with people who don't look like you, who speak a different native tongue, have different values, are less or more resourced than you, and play music you dislike or don't understand. And in some cases, it means engaging with people that don't like you, don't like your music, don't like what you represent in their histories or in their presence. And this, as anyone who's been around CNMAT, was also a set of values I shared with David Wessel and produced the incredible diversity of activities that we hosted there. So another problem is the hero-inventor problem. This sort of I think this was, you could say this might have been invented by Beethoven, but this idea that God channels goodness through you and you produce all these ideas it's been promoted by lots of inventors and so on in order to get resources. But in real life, almost everything I've done required an enormous amount of collaboration, sponsors, colleagues, people I actively build with, and mentors. And I apologize in advance that this format doesn't make it easy to acknowledge all those, but my papers and so on do their best to acknowledge people who've helped me. And my personal website is going to be expanded to try and explain that, because I think people get stuck, especially in times like COVID. And one of the best ways of getting unstuck is to find some team to join. So this talk is dedicated to the memory of a friend of mine, Michael Hawley, who died yesterday, I think. And he turns out to be very important, but is not and is widely known for many amazing things he did. It's definitely worth looking up his life's work. He's very important for this community of music hackers because Max Matthews sent him and an unusual piece of hardware to Earcam back when there was a really stupid debate we were fighting hard, which was Earcam didn't want any computer graphics involved in music. Now that may seem ridiculous now, but it has something to do with a fight with Xenakis, who was in Paris raising money and doing this project called the UPIC that was very graphic intensive. But Michael Hawley was part of a team that joined me and David Wessel and Xavier Rodet and Michel Delpin, Richard Grevis, who demonstrated by example, by hacking music graphics, the value. And I kind of got fed up with Earcam because that battle waged several years afterwards. But I think it's fair to say, without that battle, without Michael, who was I think 20 at the time, without his incredible energy and vigor, we wouldn't have had Miller Puckett over at Earcam working on Patcher, the predecessor to Max, and I wouldn't have been able to return to Earcam to develop the first digital audio workstation. It was called MacMix. So thank you, Michael. So how did I start with all this? Well, I changed schools from a school that was pretty good about music and dance in primary school to one that was not very good for me. And so it was a constant struggle. The family had, I think, 6 LPs total, which I knew very well from spinning them over and over again. And so trying to engage with music was a challenge for a young 8 to 10-year-old. But this amazing thing happened in High Wycombe, which was otherwise a sleepy town. Somebody decided to put one of the UK's first shopping malls there. American-style modern shopping mall. It's called the Octagon, and my family used to get in the car, drive up this ramp to the top of the parking structure, and then drive down the helical driveway, and then drive home, just for the thrill of it. Now, it's hard perhaps for people to realize. Everything was very square and not very high in England in the 60s. And the key thing that connects to the story as we get to the end of my talk, where I present the FingerPhone, is that there was the first elevator, or lift as they call them in the UK, I came across. And it had, I think there were 3 floors, and to get people to the various stages of this parking structure. And the key fascinating thing for me, the first time I went in it, was it had touch switches, no buttons, and they lit up and did this magic of transforming you, kind of like a TARDIS, into a new place. And so I would come home from school and skip what I was supposed to do, which was catch the bus home, and I would go straight to this elevator and ride it up and down a few times. And so this is my first contact with the magic of touch sensitivity. It was also where I learned another really important skill, which was, since this is start of some of my mischief, and I got in trouble quite a few times with the staff that managed the parking structure. And at some point they said, well, the problem with you doing this is that there are people who are actually trying to use the elevator to get from one floor to the next. So I learnt this skill of making it appear, relaxing and making it appear like I belonged somewhere, which I pretty much didn't. And I would offer to press the buttons for people, which gave me more time before being chased away and engaged in the actual function of this elevator. The other very striking thing about this, everything was, as I said, rectangular and square, but everything was octagonal and geometric and circular and helixes, you name it. You can see from the diagram on the right, which was the stairway down. Very exciting geometries for me, and I've used those geometries in lots of later projects. That's a closer shot. And here's the closer shot. Now, very important thing, at the top of the stairway was a music store, which was kind of my heaven in that time. And but I had this challenge. Since I didn't play any of the instruments and I was clearly too young to buy them, the salespeople weren't particularly happy with me being there. And so the skill of making it appear like you belong somewhere became handy, because what I would do is grab an LP from the cheap LP bag box and carry it around the store as if I was going to buy it at some point, and then noodle on the synths till they chased me away. In fact, I say synths. Mostly there were organs in there, and perhaps again for people that don't know this time, I'll just jump to a little example of what people were listening to and what people like me were finding exciting in the way of music and musical performance. Bear with me while I find the clip. Here we go. Yeah, so this was the time that organs ruled the day. And it turns out to be quite important that Moog went, from my point of view, that Moog went out of business because he was bought, his company was bought briefly by and held by a organ company, the Allen Organ Company, and he made a synthesizer on the top keyboard, which I noodled with a lot at that time. There we go. So here's another really important part of the story. So I mentioned I didn't have much music at home and there were no instruments and nobody singing. The other problem was that the BBC ran everything in terms of media and had a very, very narrow playlist. And there was basically no music from anywhere else in the world. Though, if I ever heard rock and roll, it would be a British band redoing some R&B or rock and roll American hit. And so what I discovered was if I built a radio and stuck a really long wire, so I climbed over the back out of my bedroom window and across various outhouses, buildings, I dragged a 100-foot wire and hooked it up to my little crystal set, which was handy because it didn't need a battery. And then I could hear all this music from around the world from stations like Radio Caroline, which was run by DJs who were very upset that the BBC wouldn't let them share this music and started launching boats outside of the control of the broadcasters. Radio Luxembourg was a favorite of mine with a lot of amazing R&B and early blues music I heard that way. And that meant I had this problem of staying up rather late at night, which got in the way of school, of course. So I decided I would need to be listening to music at school instead of listening to the teachers. So I built this thing in a snuff box. It's called the Mighty Midget. It was my first experience with wearables. And as some of you know, I work with e-textiles and wearable electronics, and this was one of the first of quite a few things I did as a hobbyist back then. Now, the other resource problem, so by this point I've solved the problem of hearing the music. I can't learn to play the instruments because I don't have any instruments, so I have to make them, and which was it may seem a little odd as an approach, but there were people making cars and boats from kits at that point. It was considered a stereo systems. It was considered a standard way of saving money to get something that you desperately wanted. And so let's, before we jump to that, so how did I find out how to build all this? Well, there were magazines like this, no internet, as I said, but magazines came out every month. There were actually 3 or 4 electronics magazines. They didn't cost very much, 30 pence. That was about a week or two savings of mine to get, so I had to decide which projects to do. About half the projects were sound or music oriented. This issue has one on a tremolo circuit, for example. And I was reading one of these, and then I noticed this little section. All the magazines, they had a different name for it. This one's called the Bright Ideas section. In another magazine, it was called Ingenuity Unlimited. And basically, here's the invitation I took up. Readers' bright ideas. Any idea that is published will be awarded payment according to its merit. The ideas have not been proved by us. So I decided the way to fund my hobby and get the parts I needed was to write articles. So the huge value the editor of these magazines gave me was to reject 2 of my articles, the first 2. And fortunately, I was insulated from the ego problems there, because I was at that age where you think most adults don't make any sense and their opinions shouldn't be trusted anyway. So I persisted and eventually got my first publication in. And instead of publishing a little half paragraph, they said, well, we like it, but we don't like your scruffy diagrams, so we're going to turn it into a full article. And here is the full article. It's a door beeper with a really weird amplitude modulation circuit. And I can't remember how much they sent me, but it was more than I'd ever received for anything else I'd ever done. So, and it certainly funded some parts. And it also got me past all these annoying things about publication, of accepting the fact that when you start, your stuff is lousy and it's going to get rejected. And I got an early start on learning how to be better at publishing. That gets me to this stage, which is how did the computer and because all computation pretty much up to that point was done with mechanical or electronic systems, not computer-based systems. But I got lucky in my middle school. The math teacher had access for one evening a week to a programmable calculator, and I started learning to program with it. And this is where my engagement with sine waves came from, because it was very arduous calculating things. We were tortured in math with slide rules and big books of tables to calculate sines and logarithms and those kinds of things. And so I sort of told my math teacher, well, I'd really like to get this thing to calculate sines. And he said, well, you know, the problem is your math level and where we're at now, it's calculus is what you're going to need before you're going to be able to get there. So I went to the local bookstore and bought this, which is Teach Yourself Calculus. I got fooled by the advertising. I also bought a record called How to Play Blues Guitar, the notion that you can actually learn these things from books is very spurious. I think I plowed through the first chapter of this book and got hopelessly lost, and for some reason found very near the end, I think it's, well, I wonder what my reward is if I was ever to be able to understand any of this. And I got, to me, what has been one of the most useful pieces of math. It's just in this corner here. It's Maclaurin's series, which tells you how to calculate these really valuable functions, sine x, exponentials, and so on, with a calculator that only has addition, multiplication, and division, which was all that programmable calculator had. So I wrote a library which, for some reason, Hewlett-Packard were excited about and incorporated into their user library to calculate those functions on that calculator. And that sort of started my love affair with sine waves. And strangely, that connects to my arrival in Australia when my family emigrated there to build inflatable boats. This was the competition, actually. It wasn't Zodiac. We were competing with them. But I was invited to help out with the design of the patterns for the fabric that gets cut out and glued together to make these boats. And I think you can see this boat's made of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 maybe segments glued together. And the question is, what shape do you need to make those cut out pieces of fabric so that when you roll them up and glue them together, you get the right pointy bow and that has to point up and towards itself in the middle. Well, it turns out, amazingly, the shapes you draw are sine waves. You just have to get the phase and amplitude right, and the boat miraculously gets glued up and takes its shape. So that was a key sort of moment that stuck with me. So in Australia, I got another lucky break of these sorts of random kinds. You don't really know why they happen, but I was trying to figure out which university to go to, so I went to the open house of the University of New South Wales, which had a couple of exciting things. They shared all the passwords to the computers so that the kids coming in, the visitors on open day, could play games, which I got bored with after about an hour. But I discovered through the following years that the passwords still worked. So it was kind of an open year for me of access to computers, which was a big resource problem. The exciting thing about visiting that university was they had a concert in the electrical engineering department of all places, because they were involved in working on the Fairlight CMI, the first commercial sampling synthesizer. And but perhaps more striking to me was two instruments they were playing as part of this concert. One was a huge 6-foot-long log drum, which you played by kind of pounding it with your hands or fists, and I'm fairly sure it had pressure and position sensitivity. I can't really remember if it had position in X or Y, but it was using piezo-resistive sensing, which is the first time I've seen that. So already I was 17 here. No, I was young. I must have been 16. I'd seen touch sensing, capacitive touch sensing, and resistive touch sensing. More importantly for me, the other instrument, and these instruments were part of a band called the Groupatron, there was the best guitar controller I've ever seen. Despite having tried to build some since, I don't know what happened to it, but it had strain gauges and all kinds of things. And why it was so good is the synthesis was done directly in analog with no latency, no computers involved. And it had all the things an enormous number of gestures that guitarists expect to see were sensed on that. I got to work a little bit on the Fairlight CMI because one of the co-designers of that instrument, his family owns the electronic magazine Electronics Today International, and I had published an article there on a new way of making sinusoids. And so I got involved in the additive synthesis hardware and software for the Fairlight CMI. So this is now a kind of a big leap. I think I'm skipping a few years to try to get to the digital audio workstation. Let me fill you in on a couple of, let me do the bridge, the technical bridge. So we have to, the full story has to get me from Australia to Paris and so on. But I want to tell you what happened in terms of the technical thing I carried from there. The Fairlight had a really interesting architecture. Let me go back to that picture. There we go. So it had a light pen and a graphical user interface and a whole series of pages and a very rich interface. You would be very pleased, and I think some people have tried to simulate it, you'd be very pleased using this interface today. In fact, today you would use you'd touch the screen with your finger instead of a light pen. So the thing that was interesting architecturally is it was a computer with two microprocessors, a very similar architecture to the early Arduinos, only a 1/16th as fast. But it had two of them, and back to back on the same bus, talking to the same memory. And the architecture was one of them controlled the hardware synthesis, and the other controlled the graphics and the user interface, the keyboard information, and so on. And that architecture turns out to, and I wrote some software for one of those processors, so I got intimately involved in how the information flowed between them. And that sort of early hacking and insight is why I was able to put together the first prototype of the digital audio workstation, because it's essentially that architecture. You see it on the left. And the way I like to think about it and explain it now is it doesn't matter what computer you have at hand, there's a more powerful one some distance away. So if you can get the two to talk to each other, you can have a better experience. Now at EarCam, there was an enormous VAX I installed that was supposed to do all the sound processing, and it was all out of real time and taking hours to get a few seconds of sound. And there were no graphical displays. People were doing it all with programming languages, typing in, trying to squeeze one sample at a time. But I had learnt how to do graphics programming and graphical user interfaces at Bell Labs. So I said to David, why don't I come and build a graphical sound editor for you? And he said, well, yeah, sure, come on over. We actually have Macintoshes now at EarCam. We won that battle. And but I don't want an editor. I want a mixing program. So and he wanted a user interface. The mixing program was already there. Robert Gross had written it. So the reason that MacMix has mix windows and sound at the same time is that David's push to have both. And this kind of integration of two studio processes is the beginnings of what was important about a digital audio workstation. There's actually a third thing, which is on that picture, and directly connects to Open Sound Control. Open Sound Control, as you know it, was invented later, but the idea of using a protocol between two computer systems and using textual representation of the parameters, that already existed in the very first MacMix digital audio workstation. So it turns out that MIDI 1.0 and OSC were born really at the same time, solving different problems. So what's going on is I've got a reliable computer, the Macintosh, and an unreliable computer, this big VAX that would crash several times a day. So I had to develop a communication scheme that would be robust so the Macintosh wouldn't be confused when the VAX broke and couldn't mix anymore. And so that's why these protocols are what they call stateless. I don't have to remember anything on behalf of another computer. The other thing that's key is that arrow which is labeled sound going up to the synchro box. What I did in OSC, you know, this problem is solved with timestamps. In the early days of the digital audio workstation, before we had synchronized audio interfaces and so on, I used the sound output from the Mac to start with a special driver I wrote for the VAX to start the sound coming out of the VAX. So the Macintosh knew when the sound came out. And there's a tick mark, vertical tick mark, down in the, actually I think I can, this pointer will help me here. This vertical tick mark corresponds to when I click the mouse. So when you hit play, I could mark useful points to edit with. And that click mark is the beginnings of another really key feature of digital audio workstation, which is to mark gesture like MIDI on a piano roll that runs alongside the mix or the audio tracks. So there's a little prehistory of digital audio workstations. I brought up the touch sensing and how I'd already experienced them. I was a bit surprised when Roger Lynn talked about there being two choices, capacitive or resistive. That's true if you want off-the-shelf sensors, but I recommend you look at all these other fantastic ways of sensing, acoustic, optical, time domain reflectometry, and look at different materials. And so move away from the packaged commercial ones. And it turns out this is what Theremin and other people did. There were no sensors. They had to build them from scratch. And the position sensing strip on the Theremin cello is way more accurate than the ones you can buy. And it was done in 1930, right? And if you're wondering whether it worked or whether it was just one of these goofy prototypes, there was a radio show in the US that played for quite a few years, played classical music pieces with a whole, I think this is what, a quintet, a whole bunch of these instruments. So, yeah, so that's one elephant chased out. And the next one is MIDI 1.0. There was a claim that the problem with it is it's keyboard centric. Actually, it's trigger and note centric, and I would argue it doesn't do very well for most keyboards. Let's see, do we have yeah, we probably have a moment for me to turn around and do a very quick demo. Let's just take the organ and ask ourselves, well, you know, the organ's got keys that go on and off. That's a note on and a note off. Surely that is going to do a good job for organs. So let me get going. I'm going to just slide down here, move the camera so you can see about there. And so here's an organ. Nothing happens when I hit the keys because I have to get some air going. But since I'm controlling the air, I get to control the envelope. In fact, I can get a tremolo. I've got two pedals here. If I'm gentle, I can get a tremolo. So it's a bit arduous doing this with the pedals, but this organ builder sensibly brought this thing I'm swinging out here, which so now I can pedal like a mad thing with my right foot, and again, no sound at all. The note ons, note off velocity is completely irrelevant because this is controlling the air. There's one on the right which you can't see, but if I play up in the higher pitches, let's see. I have a wah-wah going, so I get to change timbre as well. So this idea that the position in space of the key and the position of these sensors is not very well represented in Well, so okay. What about the piano? We've got the velocity, key velocity. So that's we should be able to do the kind of thing pianos players like. Well, David Wessel was told when he first went to EarCam that pianists could control the timbre of the notes they played, and he said, "Wait a minute, how's that possible? Because after you've pressed the key down, the hammer's not coupled anymore to the key, so it's going to sound like whatever the hammer flying sounds like." Well, it turns out that the piano keyboard is position sensitive as well as, well, it's a funny way of putting it. The position of the keys matters, because when you release the keys, you bring this damper down, and it turns out these musicians who were getting different sounds were doing it by shaping the decay of the sounds as in combination of deciding on how loud each note should be. And so that suggests to me, or did certainly suggest to me, that the keyboard we needs to just sense the position of the keys and send that. In fact, Remus Avicienus and I built such a keyboard and wrote a paper about that. And squeezing that into MIDI would have been ridiculous. So OSC is how we got the data. So it's funny because I would still like to have that keyboard. If I have to play a keyboard where the keys go up and down instead of a touchboard like I just built, that's what I want to see. Well, I could go on with looking at other keyboards, but probably the only keyboard that MIDI is reasonably well suited for is the clavichord, which hardly anybody plays, because the polyphonic aftertouch, if you happen to have it, is handy. So let's have a look. 11, 12. So the problem, and so David used to wear T-shirts that said "no triggers." So where do these biases come from in MIDI? Well, they come from the Western music notation and composerly music, and what I'm calling the tyrannic reign of the step sequencer. I actually love all that music for people who are using step sequences. I have no problem with it. It's just that there's a lot more music to be made, and there was a lot more music being made then. And it's a shame when the sort of when companies, groups of companies, hardwire in these narrow kinds of constraints that you have to climb around. And so OSC was really born from, not as a reaction to MIDI, but simply because it didn't do the things we needed for the instruments we had in mind to build. The instruments we had and the ones we had in mind to build. Let's see. Yeah, I think it might be worth doing this demo. Let's see. So when I was a kid, I was trying to learn to play blues guitar without any blues musicians around. So I bought this book, this LP that came with a book. And so what you end up doing is playing the music. I tried to listen to the original, couldn't figure out where the fingers or hands were going. So I sort of slavishly copied, and I can still play it the way I played it when I was 17. It sounds something like this. And so on. And then I went to a guitar camp and learned from people who'd actually met Mississippi John Hurt in the 60s and who knew how to play this, and learned. So this is the difference between the score and reality, or what sometimes is called the difference between the map and the terrain. And all these programs that display piano roll and MIDI note events, they're really showing you a notation, and interpretation musically is very hard. So the way Mississippi John Hurt would play it was more like this. And so on. So in other words, one of them you can dance to, and one is challenging. Let me put this away down here. Okay. So that's the tirade about MIDI 1.0. We've done that. We seem to have jumped back. There's a lot written about CNMAT. Happy to ask questions, but I'm going to jump now to Nomni. It's a company, after leaving CNMAT, I started to build ICs. The name, in a lot of languages, the base word for names and number are the same. And one of the features of OSC is it doesn't privilege numbers over names like MIDI does, and hence the name. And what I've done is designed a bunch of small, relatively simple, understandable ICs, and I'm going to demonstrate. Whoops, I have a little demonstrator here somewhere. Well, actually, the best way to show what's going on with these ICs, each one is about enough to build a Eurorack module around. So one of them is a top octave generator. I've got a couple of them in here, and that starts with a master clock and then generates all 12 or 13. So if you have a problem of the notes in the octave, so if you're in a Eurorack situation, as you know, getting lots of voices is challenging. So this is a small module that can get you can build chords out of and so on. Let's see. There's a module here. There's a single chip that is a step sequencer. And so basically what's inside here is a single chip and a bunch of connectors. So these are very affordable modules. And if you look on the Nomni site, you'll see all kinds of other. I developed two new ways of computing sinusoids. I don't think that will ever stop. I arrogantly thought about 20 years ago I had surveyed all the ways of making sine waves, but it's amazing actually that every new opportunity, new kind of hardware gives a new way to do a sine wave. One of those two new ways is in the chip that the FingerPhone depends on. We'll just pull the FingerPhone apart. So there's two of those top octave chips there to get me the 25 core pitches, and then these chips along here, each one doing 3 keys, manage the resistive sensing and the waveform generation, which includes pulse, square, sine. While we're doing the full tour, those are summed with these analog chips and routed to the outputs, mixed to mixed to headphone outputs and a regular line out, and also then processed to be triggers and so on for your Eurorack if you choose to plug this into Eurorack. You'll see over here a kind of empty play space. That's actually I tried a Bluetooth module in there. What is going to happen for the final version is there'll be quite a wide play space and all this panel space along here, so that you can design your own. The top plate is actually a PC board. You'll be able to design your own functions and get the inputs and outputs you need on an add-on board. So that's one area of hackability of the FingerPhone. So the next slide basically says FingerPhone. The first instrument I made was relating to the FingerPhone was when I was 17. You know, I mentioned I didn't have any instruments to play, and I wanted to learn piano or organ, and the stylophone didn't cut it because it was monophonic. So I thought, well, can't I build the same circuit that was in that elevator onto separate keys? So I actually built a 2-octave touch instrument, and I had a number of challenges with it. First of all, it was heavy and bulky, and only had one waveform. The other was that the circuit board corroded very quickly, oxidized very quickly, and of course the more you play it, the more copper goes green and becomes less conductive and so on. So that problem gets solved by using gold, which wasn't available to me when I was 17, on the FingerPhone. The other problem I had was it just wasn't very sensitive, and that's because I was laying out circuit boards with little bits of black tape, so I couldn't do what I can do on the fingerboard. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to see. There's a maze texture there. Well, that's the key to, yeah, there you go. That's the key to the sensitivity of this instrument. So I solved the weight by designing my own chips and got more waveforms, again, by having my own chips in there, and I got the reliability. You can clean this with hand sanitizer, and that puts it in a category of instruments I'm very interested in, another member of which is the ukulele, for example, which is an instrument you can go to a party or a gathering of some kind and share with people. That starts a conversation, allows people to share music with each other, and we don't really have a particularly good one for electronic music or for in the sense that when you have a flat touch surface, you are inviting all kinds of gestures that aren't the ones that you have to go find a piano teacher for. So let me just show you. I'm not going to go do a full demo of the FingerPhone because there's lots of that on the Kickstarter site. But I want to show you some hacks, since it's a community of hackers, that you can do, which might explain why I didn't go with a capacitive surface. Well, there's two reasons I didn't go for capacitive, at least two. One is that capacitive surfaces have latency, and there's no latency in this one. Your finger bridges the conductors, and that directly starts the chip's outputting. There's no microcontroller, there's no software. It just goes. So let me now swing this down. I'm going to disappear, and you'll see the fingerboard. So you can do fingery pianistic things on it, but if you give this to, and I recently gave it to a friend who gave it to a 2.5-year-old, you can very quickly find drawing shapes on it, thinking of it just like you would a cell phone or something, or starting with a gesture and then squeezing it, pinching it, sliding it. I found it fun to not think about harmony, but just do it with these kind of, it's got a kind of polyphonic noodling invitation that most instruments don't have. And also it makes things that are traditionally kind of tricky you have to learn to do, like all this stuff of jumping, tucking your thumb on, jumping. You can get some of these nice, much like playing a harp, you can get the diatonic run, or by some miracle, keyboards, you can set them up so that they're evenly spaced diatonically and chromatically. So these, we can also go down chromatically. So this is an instrument that invites play and gesture in a way that perhaps is less intimidating than regular keyboards. But the big thing, nice thing about having the conductors available and the immediacy is that I can find alternative ways of playing it. So if I breathe on it, it gives you an idea of how sensitive it is, and the sound, there we go, different evaporation rates. So I took some conductive foam, and so if you wanted to build a auto harp, this is sort of the beginnings of that hat. Let me just change a few sounds around so you can get a different idea. So that spacing was just done by eye and a little bit of a glue. Let's see. I wrapped some conductive fabric around the end of a mallet I had handy, so I'm kind of curious what the mallet technique might look like. I think you probably want to use since it's smaller, you want to go for a smaller mallet. So I put these together with bamboo sticks and more foam. But I'm not a mallet player, but this is a hack you could play with. These days we've got all these wonderful materials. This is a kind of really exotic conductive silicone. You can play it with a pen, like the stylophone. Of course, you're not tethered. Let's see, what else do I have? I've got all kinds of. Yeah. Well, let's leave it at that and switch to questions. Is my microphone still noisy?
It is, yes, it is a little bit noisy. I don't know if there's something you can try to do about it.
Did I forget to push the magic button? I probably did forget to push. No, I have disabled audio processing. How is it now?
It's the same.
It's noisy, as in hiss noise?
As in background noise. Like is the microphone next to a fan or something?
Well, yeah, the laptop is getting... fan is running.
Yeah. Great. Well, so we don't have much questions just yet in the chat, so I will start by asking you some questions. So you did evoke a lot of the things that you did. I mean, you went to CNMAT, which the research part of CNMAT is not functioning anymore, is it?
That's right. Not too long after David Wessel died, the music department and the dean decided to stop research at CNMAT.
Right. And so for people who don't know what CNMAT is, it's UC Berkeley University, so north of San Francisco, and it was a historical research center that was very active in researching computer music. What does it stand for, CNMAT?
Center for New Music and Audio Technologies.
Right.
David, after a while, didn't like the name because he was very interested in science, and we made a lot of contributions to science as well as the technology in there has to do with the funding. And we were an unusual center because not so much these days, but the Silicon Valley was much more active in sound and music. So when I think there's a few centers now, Sennheiser and Meyer Sound, for example, very important sponsors for us. They're still around, but it used to be a lot richer. A lot of the software companies, Opcode and so on, were centered here. So we really built this center around collaborations with the community, both the industrial community that sponsored some of our projects, but also a lot of the early Max objects that you use were written by people which at EarCam, when David was responsible for this, they were called squatters. David and I have got in trouble most of our careers for opening institutions up to outside people to enrich them when the inside of the institution didn't like it. And I think our case has been made by the amazing things. You know, our first work on neural networks was done with David and Mike Lee. Well, Mike Lee was our first PhD student, but actually he wasn't a UC Berkeley PhD student. So it started from there and went on. So many contributions by opening up the institution. That's a big debate. There's not much time to go into that debate, but I do want to suggest, since I'm not part of academia right now, that if anyone wants to seriously undertake an expansion of their interactions, whether you're a makerspace and you want to get involved in a university, or you're an individual want to get involved, I've had a lot of experience sort of floating around in the maker scene, the industrial scene, the academic scene, and I will certainly facilitate and help in that direction if anyone wants to take it on. As was pointed out in previous talks, these institutions tend to be siloed with their own intellectual property challenges and their own value systems that don't always coincide. But I'm kind of a specialist in ironing out value systems, identifying them and ironing out and finding in those tensions something creative that can be done.
Right. So is that an invitation for people to contact you to get?
Please. Please.
To get some
Yes.
connections. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The reason I put the word serious attempt is that I had a few interactions with people who wanted to make their academic departments more accessible to women or minorities. And they wanted me, since I've been successful at that in my own teaching classes, they wanted to basically me to fix the copy on their websites and the marketing side. And that doesn't work. You actually have to fix the institution. If you don't have happy women graduate students in there, you probably have a faculty member who's a problem. And so when I say serious, if you are willing to engage, and you probably need a higher, if you're a professor in one of these institutions, you're probably going to need a dean or someone at a higher level to behind you to make the changes. But I've dealt with the same kinds of challenges in some of the maker spaces. Some of the maker spaces are wonderful. Some of them are gendered, and I always in those spaces I try to find someone who doesn't look like me to co-teach. That's one of my strategies. Right. We have to send the message that this is available. An inclusive message is available for everyone to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a wider opportunity now, especially after COVID, for maker spaces, for the music hack space, for us here, to generate knowledge, to share knowledge in a completely different way. I mean, this is one of them, doing live streams that everyone can watch on different medium that come twice a week and have great content and great luminaries, both from academia, but also from the world of music making or hardware engineering and other disciplines.
Well, I also want to, there's something very important I want to say about that, I think, because it turns out that if you work on these music instrument issues, you learn a lot that will be helpful, for example, in medical technologies. So right now I'm judge of the Hackaday competition, which is focused around all kinds of projects that are in some way recognizably good for society, for non-profits, for medical things, and we need a lot of those. But, take a look outside the music and sound interest and look at what people are doing, because there's a two-way communication. If you're building interfaces where the body's going to interact with them, like my touch, then you probably can learn a lot from people building wearables and medical sensors. So that's another kind of openness I'd like to encourage, and check out the Hackaday competitions around that. And
yeah, and I would love for you to relate a bit later about e-textile. I'm going to bring up a question from Sarah Davis. Curious if you considered making the FingerPhone or violin as a more obscure configuration since it can be played as drone?
Yeah, perhaps I can illustrate that with, yeah, where's my other board? Yeah, on the back there, can you see this big gold thing here? That's an 8x8 position and pressure sensitive pad using the same patterning. This patterning, the maze pattern I've invented, is quite general, so you could build all kinds of the classic noise instruments. In fact, I work with Martin Deby in France, who just sent me this wonderful, it's a 555 timer with all kinds of interesting maze patterns to work with as a touch instrument. So yeah, Sarah, I am very interested in that, and I would like to build, if we can launch this one successfully, I'd like to build FingerPhones in the same form factor because it's so easy to share them and carry them around safely in laptop bags. I'd like to put a more experimentally looking touch layout on a future instrument. The chips are already, and I should mention the chips are already there. I have a circuit bending specialist chip with all the classic things people have done since the 70s in circuit bending. But I may have erroneously concluded that the Kickstarter audience would want to see a keyboard, a more conventional thing.
Right, and connecting this to e-textiles. So at some point in your career, you got really interested in every possibility of including fabric, as a way to control.
Well, it turns out most of the regular materials and the processes come out of the military, including the 19-inch rack. They come out of military electronics and robustness, and they're always pretty rectangular. But the human body is not rectangular, and all the gestures we do on instruments are curves. So I got very interested in paper. This is the paper FingerPhone, which is flexible and uses conductive paper. And I got interested in all these materials. This is a multi-touch done by Yotam Man and Youngsim Ro with an amazing new thread, and that's completely flexible. There's just some amazing materials. This is silver-plated nylon and then conductive silicone on the back. So I started collecting those materials and wanted to start teaching it. And fortunately, a bunch of the now pioneers of that e-textile interactive world asked me for materials and came and taught classes with me. And now we have a long history of some amazing projects. I can. I think one of the things I want to mention is the feel of touch of an instrument is really important. What you're actually touching. So I can plonk this on top of the FingerPhone. It's a silicone set of switches. So if you happen to like that silicone rubbery bouncy thing going on, you can do that on top of the surface. Personally, I find them sticky and slimy, and I have 25-year-old silicone that from mice and so on from a long time ago that are completely sticky and melted. So I don't think it's sustainable as a material. So I'm very interested in new materials, ones that are sustainable. And so the reason we built this was to try to help David have an even more sensitive instrument that he could roll up instead of carrying this thing. It's called the slabs, and it is a rather big slab because you want the big space, but we wanted to roll it up. So that's still definitely possible, and having chips and the right materials is the path to that. So if you
we do have a question that relates to the touch. So Alexander, thank you Alexander for asking. So what do you think about the keyboard? How it tries to market general music stores? And do you think that keyboard interface always needs to have And a component of the question is
there's like three questions in there in a way.
Yes.
I've seen some amazing performances on the Seaboard. I think there's a tension between. It's definitely an instrument that encourages does well with a strong piano technique, because the black keys in some sense are raised. So when you lay it out on the flat and you don't have any key movement, you have some interesting affordances that you can't do with raised notes. As I mentioned, I find it's hard to do slides because they're sticky. You can control the smoothness of silicone, but it's still a bit sticky. So I think there's room for all these people to try these things. The availability in the general stores is an amazing accomplishment. I'm actually amazed that I can go. That's one of the huge challenges, is people need to try these instruments, and so you need to be able to get them in the stores. So the fact that the Apple stores and guitar centers are a place you can go to try them is huge thing. It's obviously something I'm struggling with, communicating the physical experience of a FingerPhone on Kickstarter when you can't actually hold one.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you for answering that question. So another controversy. So you hinted at MIDI 1.0 as being inefficient, in fact, for keyboard. But do you have any thoughts on MIDI 2.0? Have you looked at the specs and
Yeah, I've looked at the specs, and had a flash of arrogance, as we often do, which is, they put a lot of things that we were already doing with OSC. But there's something much more optimistic about the spec that I want to mention, which is in the history of MIDI is interesting. There was a nice window where a MIDI user group opened up at the beginning and tried the early interfaces and gave all kinds of feedback and said, we can help you improve this thing. And the MIDI manufacturers said, no, we don't want that. We're going to have a MIDI Manufacturers Association. We're going to decide what it is. We don't want to talk to you. This is written up in a really nice book. This is just a piece of history, which I'll put the references to. But so I was just amazed that the MMA, that association, was asleep at the wheel. They missed specifying USB in time, how to do it over Ethernet. They kept missing it. People started doing it anyway, and then we ended up with multiple messy standards. Even till recently, I'm just looking at putting MIDI on my instruments, and I have two standards for doing it, two contradictory ways of doing it on the 8th inch. So amazingly slow organization. But that's changed. It took a while. I know a lot of wrangling and changed, but it's got people who have looked more widely and who are involved in companies doing things where they really need to change MIDI. So I'm optimistic. I'm especially optimistic, actually, because as soon as they improve the kinds of communication we can do between devices and computers, we get that same improvement with OSC, because we can tunnel OSC over MIDI. As you know, some people hide MIDI messages in OSC and send that over Wi-Fi and unscramble it. A lot of the MIDI Wi-Fi works that way, but we can also do it the other way around. In fact, we have done that.
Yeah, well, that's exciting to hear. I should point out that I've been on the board of the MMA for some time, and I can attest that the organization has changed recently and is currently really opening up to include a lot more new companies, big and small, to make the change operate much faster. But MIDI 2.0 is a remarkable change. I mean, it's like changing from 2D to 3D. It's going to be very difficult as well for developers to implement at first. But the idea is that for users, it's going to be to be seamless. That's the end goal.
Yeah, and so what that means is that MIDI 1.0 and OSC, as it currently is, will still be very active, because I can download libraries for the Arduino IDE as a beginner programmer and produce MIDI messages and OSC messages actually on the same chip at the same time. I can do that without the kinds of heavy development needed. So that just important to remember that these things aren't alternatives. We often build arguments, but they're actually additions. And so we can grow our knowledge and experience with the earlier standards and with the simpler standards, and then reach towards the fancy stuff.
Right. Well, on the subject of OSC, there's a few questions that I'm not going to take in order of coming, but this one is interesting. What's the most expected?
I was a bit shocked to discover that people were playing around with the idea that the rides in Disneyland, the solenoid, should be controlled by OSC. I once, for an academic exercise in a class I was taking, I wrote a recipe in OSC, and this was for a midterm exam, which I fortunately got a reasonable grade with, because the test of how good a job I'd done was somebody had to cook from thank you Alexis incidentally for cooking this Italian dish from the recipe. So let's see, unusual uses. One thing I should mention, Mark Seiden and I, this is a precursor protocol to OSC. We built the largest Macintosh peripheral at the time because the Earcam's acoustic concert hall space had these rotating prisms, and I wrote a paint program that communicated to the mechanics, so you would just paint the acoustical feel you wanted in the room, and then this enormous mechanical system would start rotating the walls to get the panels in the right place. So this idea of a small computer, small interface controlling something big is something I'm excited about. Of course, Maya Sound does a lot of things with OSC involved in spatialization, but they also, for Cirque du Soleil, they use protocols like that to launch acrobats into the air on these huge pneumatic things. It's always frightened me a little bit. I work with them because you've got to be careful to make sure that the timestamps are good, because you don't want to launch someone from a platform onto something that they're supposed to land in that isn't in place at the time. So
yes,
yeah. So those are some unusual.
So a few more questions. Going back to textile. Are there pressure-sensitive e-textiles that are being used in music interface? Thank you, Nathan, for the question.
Keith McMillan's instruments. I shared some early prototypes at CNMAT with Keith, and he built some instruments that used the piezo-resistive textiles. From the hacker point, the hacker community is very upset with Keith because he took control of the supply. But I'm happy to announce that some of those people got so angry that they have posted how to make your own piezo-resistive materials with reasonable, chemistry you can do safely at home. And this is a piece of paper, for example, that Martin Deby just sent me. I just cut it up to be the size of the black key. If you lay it on the FingerPhone, you can have actually even more pressure sensitivity than the end of your finger. So yes, they are being used in musical interfaces. I like them a lot compared to conductive rubber because they bounce back with the same responsiveness of year after year. They last a very long time if you use the right fabric, and I've written papers about that. Call me up if you want to know which fabrics to do what with, but it's a very rich open area.
Yeah, and on the question, or things that you can follow up maybe after, we have a question from Aaron, who was very interested in getting a copy of the book that you mentioned about MIDI and the history of MIDI.
Yes. That book is called Any Sound You Can Imagine. and it's a look at the amazing long history of music companies and their value systems. They almost all sold their first synthesizer products with that banner, any sound you can imagine. So it's a great book, and it does cover the early MIDI period.
All right. Okay. So we have 14-bit MIDI asking, what's your opinion on touch screens?
Well, most of them are capacitive. This is a long story. I love having the screen underneath. That's the good news. The bad news is that when you put your hand on the screen, you can't see what's underneath it. So that's a fun tension that every user interface builder has to deal with. The other one is that it's quite hard to get a wide range of pressure sensitivity on a touchscreen. Because the screen doesn't go anywhere, it's for other reasons rigid, and it's hard to get a very dense, precise set of measurements. So one of the things you can do, which I really like, is to take your touch screen and stick 4 pressure sensors on the corner, FSR, piezo-resistive fabric. And then you get very nuanced pressure. You can push really hard or really soft. That's the key for David Wessel's instrument and many of these instruments, is the dynamic range. You want to be able to hammer it with a stick or stroke it gently. And that range is hard to achieve on a touchscreen. I think that's probably the fastest way of putting it.
Right. And it's interesting because they are ubiquitous now. Pretty much everybody has a touchscreen interface in their pocket, and as a musical instrument, we can see as well that, or at least as a digital audio workstation, a lot of companies have made a sort of reduced version of what you can get on a laptop. Available.
What I love about applications like Touch OSC is that you can, before you commit hard to new hardware or new things, you can prototype interactions. They may not be as nuanced as you eventually want them to be, but you can try different layouts quickly. You can talk to you before you've even built your new synthesizer, you can talk to an existing synthesizer because it does MIDI as well as OSC. So I think of these, there's a lot of lovely scaffolding you can do towards something you might want with touch screens. And I would say I'm really happy that people work on projects like Touch OSC. It was very hard for us to have the resources at CNMAT to build something that good because the manufacturers of the operating system and so on make it really difficult to get the core gestures out. Apple was famous for that. In fact, they patented a lot of the gestures, and they wanted to decide how they were going to be used, and so that you couldn't get to the core data. So tip of the hat to everyone who just forged ahead anyway. But I think that largely that problem is solved on tablets, laptops, and phones. You can get the key data out.
Right. So I guess you mentioned to Apple to please be a bit more transparent about your APIs. Good luck with that. I got off the Apple bus a long time ago for that reason. And since they're losing market share on laptops and so on, maybe it's a good argument. They should ask what used to be one of their top industries, the music industry, one of their top users, why they're losing users, and that's one of the reasons. Right. A question from Radio Waves. Are you still involved with the O.dot framework for Macs? Are you still mainly using Macs for the software part of your project?
Well, I interact with the people that do maintain O.dot. O.dot was the last major project at CNMAT. It's sort of counted on by quite a few people in the world in their own music production, including the original John McCallum, the main force behind ODOT. So I actually work more on another piece of OSC. If I am developing on OSC related things, it's the Arduino library. I tend to work on that end, and then the ODOT runs in things like Max MSP and on the computer platforms. What I'm finding is a lot of people, there are new platforms that are Arduino-like, wireless, Bluetooth, and so on, and it's hard work keeping libraries up to date. So my focus has been on that.
Right. Well, I think it's time for us to wrap it up, but it's not the last we'll see of you. We had a nice chat earlier this week where I asked you about doing a workshop.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of ideas, and I want to have as many workshops as possible on a lot of subjects. And I think one that people are very eager to have is around electronics and starting to build an electronic kit to make music, starting to with affordable material that they can get shipped from home, and we can have a nice online workshop to build instruments. But there's a range of things you could cover, and I'd love to see more.
That particular one is very timely, isn't it? Because of the scarcity problem. I don't have any of my early prototypes because I dismantled them to make the next thing. And so we're in this situation where the best component to use is probably from some device you have on hand. So that would be an interesting, scavenged local materials. I mean, you've seen me use bits of foam and all kinds of things that were around the house. So you don't have to have a fancy lab. You may need some ingenuity, and it's that necessity is the mother of invention.
Indeed. Well, circuit bending would be also a fantastic workshop idea where people could bring their old electronic toys from when they were kids and open them up and wire them or rewire them somehow to change the sound they make.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that because we're in a position where we can actually build instruments which are for bending in the first place. I mean, I know there's just the idea of taking something and repurposing it in a weird way is a very important value in that community. But it's also interesting to think about, well, what if I knew people were going to do that? What would it look like? I would love to work on both those sorts of things, like which things are the best to bend. Why would you want to use food as your interface to your musical instrument? Those kinds of questions are great fun.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few comments, and in fact, a lot of questions have just came as I was saying that we should close. But let's take the first one that came. So I suppose this relates to the FingerPhone.
Yes, I have all the pressure information there. The FingerPhone campaign will have to sort of go. So please take a look at that campaign and sign up and share it with your friends. Yes, it's possible to add MIDI and OSC. It may be an add-on board using that interface I suggested on the add-on card, but it could also be built in.
Okay.
That's a definite maybe, in other words.
Okay, so one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. So 14-bit MIDI is asking, what do you wish for the future of audio, MIDI, OSC, and controllerism? The future of musicianship, I suppose.
Well, I'm interested in making instruments that have this social quality I mentioned, where they're shareable and they encourage people to make music and talk about music, especially people who feel somehow excluded, either because of physical limitations, the context they come from. So I'm interested in this category of instruments which are transition instruments. So if you take a bassoon or an oboe, it's really hard to play those. It's actually even really hard to make the reeds for them before you can even play them. But the starter instrument is the recorder. So that's two aspects of an instrument, you could ask yourself, well, can I get really young people, 2-3-year-olds engaged with this instrument? And can I make an instrument that's still interesting for people with 30 years experience as musicians? Is it possible to do that in one instrument? Is it possible to make instruments that will last 100 years? And if you're making transition instruments, you have to kind of decide, well, what are you helping people transition to? And that brings you into the wonderful world of acoustic instruments, from which we have an enormous, valuable information as we interact with those. So I think the future may have something to do with a better blend. Instead of making electronics deliberately make us stand out and look different to those, how can we blend the best and understand the best of both? So that's actually a big agenda. The FingerPhone is the first chance I've had the liberty to both reflect and do the technology to make a statement in that. And I already know from the couple of prototypes I have here, sharing it with my family and cleaning it thoroughly and sharing it with a few people, that it definitely has that feature I was talking about of the kind of conversation piece. It's not an instrument you're going to use as a trophy and hang on the wall. You're going to take it with you and share with people because there's a lot to enjoy. A lot of joy can be had out of the engagement with the instrument. Oops.
I was on mute. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to present today and answer questions from people. As I said, it's not the last. I would like to see of you, but if we could organize a workshop or series of workshops, Alexander also confirms that a workshop where you can make your own sensitive textile and hooking it to Max would be of interest. So I would also want to host it and support it to happen, but I also want to attend such a workshop. I think it would be very interesting.
Great. So I look forward to gathering my friends who do that kind of thing, and we can co-teach it. It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to say that I contacted Sam Topley, a person who you recommended to me,
yes,
who lives in the UK in Leicester, and she is going to do a workshop on with a giant pom-pom that when you squeeze, they make sound, and it's going to be on the 8th of August.
That will be great. I have taken that workshop, and there's several kinds of magic involved that are delightful with building interfaces with pom-poms.
Yeah, I very much look forward to this. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Esteban, Thierry, Martin, Nella, and everyone else for commenting. And I will see you at the next broadcast. Goodbye. Great. Goodbye, Adrian. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.